And welcome to another episode of The Focal Thought. My guest today is Leticia Nieto. How are you, Leticia?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Glad to have you on board this episode. So, just for our listeners out there, Dr. Nieto, you are an individual, couple, and family counselor. You've got your master's in human development and have your doctorate in psychology as well. And you've earned your trainer, educator, and practitioner of psychodrama. And your areas of focus are anti-oppression, which I want to speak with you in this episode today, expressive art therapies, playback theater, and appreciative inquiry. And then you've also got your book, which I believe you're co-author of, called Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment, a developmental strategy to liberate everyone. And this is basically an analysis of the psychological dynamics of oppression and privilege. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So first off, I wanted to just sort of, I was looking up the dictionary definition of oppression. And, there's many definitions, but one that stuck out, it says that oppression is prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment or control. What are your thoughts about that definition? Do you agree with it or anything to add to it?
Yeah, I think that the working definition that I carry around is about conditions that are dehumanizing, right? So if you want to say that it's cruel for people to have limited access to all the roles that they would otherwise have access to, or to all of the developmental potentials that they would otherwise have access to, or the economic and social and institutional pathways that they would otherwise have access to. So I think of it as a limiter of our intrapsychic space, and also restrictive in the ways that we relate to each other interpersonally and in groups, and group to group, as well as limiting the access or influence of anyone who's marginalized.
Yes, and anything that is limiting is not natural because we as human beings and life forces in this earth, our natural ability is to be limitless, right?
Right, to be ever expanding in our own sense of what constitutes the sense of self, right? So that we move through a process of orienting to the world as individuals, and then we grow our sense of what matters to anyone who's close to us, and then that circle widens and widens to the point where people we consider to be mature or fulfilled human beings tend to have a really, really wide orientation to their decision making, so that they take into consideration what might be beneficial or good for many people, whether they know them or not, and even broader, the consideration of many beings, the entirety of nature, becoming a part of the sense of self, so that choices that we make grow more responsible and more embracing in that evolutionary process.
So in terms of the evolutionary process, where do you see us today in terms of oppression? Are we, where we were, way back when it was, sort of integral in our society and, not sort of watched or discussed? Or have we actually made a lot of improvements, or are we sort of finding ourselves? Where's a sort of temperature check in today's world?
Yeah, I have a few metaphors that kind of overlap here. One is the idea of skill sets, or a widening range of options for how to respond. And I think that I kind of visualize that as a sort of like a fountain, where the littlest bowl of the fountain is at the top. And when it fills, it begins to spill into the next one. But the top one is still full, and then the next one, and then the next one, and like that. And so I think of the idea of range rather than stage. So the question is, what are the conditions that permit, support, hold well, or overhold any of those breaths or any of those expansions or spillages, if you want. And so I think that over time in the collective story of the planet, there is evidence that we conditions arise that permit those big shifts, those big mimetic shifts. When those shifts happen, it's not a guarantee that we now live from the wisest place, but that makes that next layer begin to be available. So I would say that we are progressing all the time into more of that option, and that the moment that we live, we can look back and see that some of the options available now were not available before, but neither have the problems of the past been thoroughly handled and resolved so that we don't have to worry about them anymore, because those tend to also morph, like a virus that keeps changing and adapting to be a different form of itself. So while we don't have the same exact forms of those oppressive dynamics being in the foreground in the same shapes, those energies of dehumanization have morphed and become, in some cases, more subtle, in other cases, just more passively incorporated such that they are not noticed, but they remain with us. So the question is not, have we taken care of oppression, or even is oppression a problem that we solve, but rather it's a condition or a set of conditions of dehumanization. And what grows is our ability to be in relationship, in skillful, adaptive relationships, so that we create more humane and more capacious and more just structures, which also involves in every case the outgrowing of something that systemically that is no longer useful to us. So we are dismantling as we create.
Correct. And I like that you use range rather than stages, because a range means it's flexible and it can also go forward, but it can also go backwards as well, right? Like we can advance ourselves, but then something can happen and we can also, de-advance ourselves.
Yeah, I think of it less as travel and a little bit more as almost like a vocal range. Like on any given day, a singer might find that a note is easier to reach or harder to reach, right? If a person has hit a note before, maybe a challenging note, like a high note, their chances of being able to do that again are improved, right? Because they know kind of how to position their body and their head and the cavity of their throat to produce that sound. And so the more they do it, the more likely that they're going to be able to do it. But it doesn't mean that now becomes the only note they sing, right? If the conditions are not conducive, that very same singer might find that they can't sing that note, even if they've sung it before. So one of the elements that I'm interested in bringing forward is how we might relate to one another with accountability and a compassionate grace that says, I want to co-create the conditions that will make you access your most justice-oriented capacity, right? Your strongest, your best skills. But if I catch you not using those skills, and I've known you to have those before, then along with my disappointment, I want there to be a layer of recognition that those conditions are not great all the time, and to be able to move quickly from the disappointment to some kind of welcome, so that I can support you coming back to your best self. Because what I've noticed is that we don't necessarily benefit, developmentally speaking, we don't benefit from an overload of challenge. We benefit from a balance of challenge and support.
Okay.
So if we create, really, if the conditions are challenging, and in addition to that, there's judgment and critique, that can work against the progress that we want. So I am not interested in relieving responsibility from any of us regarding the work of humanizing and creating justice. But I am interested, especially inside movements, in growing more durable relationships that don't rupture because of that kind of disappointment.
No, this is good, because when you're dealing with these sort of issues, most people deal with it on the surface level. And I've always said the symptoms are not to be cured. It's always, the underlying issues that have to be looked at. So you're actually going back into the context of, conditioning and environment, and actually, using psychology and some of its techniques, looking at that so that, because in NLP, neuro linguistics programming, in that realm, they always separate the behavior from the person. And like you're saying, different conditions will bring about different behaviors.
Right. And for those of us, I think that that are really interested in change, there's this parallel process. On the one hand, we feel urgent about some of the changes that we can see that need to happen around climate change, around restoring our relationship to each other, to nature, around really bringing accountability to state-sponsored violence and systems that restrict and dehumanize. We want to make those changes, and we want to make them as quickly as we possibly can. And that's one part of the parallel. The other part of the parallel is the recognition that humans develop in a kind of in spirals, right? That we have accountability to co-create conditions that make it more likely that that we as people will develop that broader range of roles and those wider and more resourced and more mature capacities. And that's not about installing a tyranny that everybody has to agree or that everybody has to behave in a certain way, but rather a recognition that the more we can encounter each other in facilitative ways, in other words, I meet you where you are with readiness to co-create with you the best conditions for what is emergent, so that that idea of we meet each other where we are, but in an invitational way to become even more, and you meet me in the same way. And that's one way to think about the I-thou relationship. So and simultaneously, if you encounter me and I don't appear ready to make progress on something that movement sees as crucial, that you don't wait for me, but you make the change, right? You don't get distracted with trying to change hearts and minds before changing systems. We go ahead and change systems. And in the process, by changing systems, we create better conditions to change hearts and minds. There's a way that we can get distracted in the imagination that we have to first change everybody's mind and come to some kinds of agreements. That's not really quite right. We don't need to convince each other, or especially shame each other, into some sort of alignment, agreement, and conformity before we can bring about the kinds of changes that we see as urgent.
Sure, because then in some sense, by devising these, set of rules and structures, that in itself can be a form of oppression, right? If you're forcing to do people, if they're forcing to do things that people generally won't do. I see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can, there's a way that insisting on installing or requiring certain ways of being may or may not rise to the level of oppression, because it may be operating in the opposite direction, but it may not be effective. I'm much more interested in that question.
Correct.
What's effective? Okay. Yeah.
With oppression, so I mean, when you're talking of oppression, it could be things that are very transparent or very subtle. And, whether it's transparent or subtle, it doesn't matter, because it's oppressive, and it'll have the same sort of effect on a small scale or, a larger scale as well. And in these days, we're dealing with, repression in terms of, and just some examples are age or gender or race or position, the title you might have at work in a career field, CIS, sexism, classism, ableism, these are all different sort of categories of oppression. The basis of oppression is some sort of bias, I think on a fundamental level, and also to some extent, a fear of the unknown. Now, I know you're approaching this from a social sort of perspective, but do you think people with these biases and, being oppressive because of that, does that have anything to do with our biological setting or an evolution setting? And once again, I'm not saying that as an excuse to excuse it, but, we look at things like, say, in the animal kingdom, where, parents are, killing and eating their offspring. There's cases of infanticide. And then even in humans, up until very recently, there were, cases of, infanticide, where people were killing their babies, whether boys or girls, and for different reasons. So do you think on a starting point or a fundamental level, this has anything to do with biology or evolution?
I think it has to do with the same idea that we start narrow and we grow wide, or we start shallow and we grow deep. That in order to survive, right, animals, including us, might do all kinds of things that we might find morally incorrect from a different vantage point. So the dehumanizing factor of oppression is the creation of conditions where people's survival is put at risk, right? And so how we widen is through being permitted and then supported into maturation, individually and collectively. So it is not so strange to encounter a young child who seems to be very selfish and doesn't want to share their toys, and they experience the other as an impingement on their freedom, and they might act out with violence or other very narrow responses. But as we become adolescents and then as adults, there need to be more ways of being that take into consideration the reality and the disproportionality of impact of dehumanization. So the more we widen, the more we can start to read the world, right? That idea from Paulo Freire that we are examining the world and noticing that it isn't a completely even or equitable proposition, that there are elements of advantage, systemic ones, not personal ones. I don't encounter too many people in my day-to-day life, and I haven't for decades. I don't encounter too many people who have a real conviction that some people are more valuable than others and that some people deserve more than others as a personally held idea or belief. But what there is a kind of fog or gas or something that makes really clear inequality difficult to perceive. And there's almost like antibodies or allergies to the recognition of some of that injustice. But when we come to the place where we can recognize the injustice, very quickly, abilities free up, if you will, to act to build more justice. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think the evolutionary impulse is towards liberation. And I don't think there's a determinism that says that we have to dehumanize one another. But every moment in the story of humans, probably true for other species as well, shows what conditions foment and permit cooperation, and what conditions, particularly exploitation, result in more violence and even self-sabotage. So we're responsible to create the conditions for our own liberation.
And from what you're saying, it's quite the irony, because people are born fully open, hunger to expand and learn. But like you're saying, if we're starting narrow and then go wide, it's because of worldview, cultural view, environment view, the conditions that set the viewing. For parents to teach their children, they're almost teaching them, and with the systems in place, they're starting narrow because of that. And then only with maybe awareness, or if you've had the good fortune of meeting someone who has this knowledge to help you expand from that narrowness.
And there's a paradox in that as well, because we understand development to be a dance of attachment, separation, and then integration, which is object relations theory that suggests that a really, really good attachment, so deep embeddedness in one moment, can actually support an emergence in the next breath. So what we need at each point is unique and distinct. We move back and forth in a kind of figure and ground dance from being part of something and blending into it completely, if you will, fully adapting to that family context or that social context and absorbing it thoroughly. And then we emerge, we differentiate, just like we emerge from the womb and are no longer the womb, but it is where we came from. We emerge over and over again and begin to have a relationship to the context that once completely held us. This is one of the ways to understand liberation, is to be able to differentiate enough to read or relate to, rather than be embedded in a particular social construction or meaning-making strategy. And this is something that happens quite naturally when conditions are right. There is a sense of ripening, a sense of hatching that we know a lot about how to create it. We know that attunement, for example, is key. We know that that balance of challenge and support will bring the climate, if you want to, or support those conditions, and that there's a different thing that's needed when the egg is hatching. When the egg is needing to be warmed, and then there's a different thing that's needed when the chick or the bird is almost completely emerged, or the chrysalis and the butterfly is almost completely emerged, and that there's a different relationship then to be had when that entity is no longer contained inside the previous context, but ready to have a new relationship, and the new adventures, and even the ability to fly.
And then the old ways during attachment are no longer valid, or not required once the emergence has happened, right? Because you're taking on the next chapter in life, so to speak.
Well, worse than that, more intense than that, those previous modes and ways that once surrounded and really were necessary for our existence, first we differentiate from them, but then we internalize them. In other words, they become capacities inside of us. The image is it. And sometimes I perform this with my students with a scarf. I am wrapped in the scarf, right? So I'm a big scarf, and I'm inside of it like a cocoon. And then I emerge from it. But then the scarf, I kind of pull it under my shirt, and pull it out my sleeve, so that I now have that which before was having me. So we actually grow by taking more responsibility, absorbing more of that environmental layer, and transforming it in the process. We change society by becoming, rather than just by chipping away at it. So there is this, we are society. Society doesn't exist as a separate entity, right? We are the collective. We form all the things that we want to change. We are them. And so if we evolve, all of it evolves.
Got it. Okay. And that's the paradox you're speaking of, because once you've transformed, you've liberated your previous self, you've shed the snakeskin, but unfortunately at the same time that's internalized in you.
Well, unfortunately and fortunately, because as it's absorbed in, right, I actually am developing things like antibodies and realizations. So yes, it will always live in us. We don't ever leave any of our previous selves behind. It's a little bit like you were saying, do we really regress, or are we just a nested sequence? If we think about the nested bowls that you might have, in your kitchen, we don't ever leave that smaller part of the fountain behind. We are everyone we've ever been. All of that lives in us, but we can begin to orient to how we host our previous versions of ourselves. We host them, and that's a function of responsibility. We host the wounded earlier parts. We host the more limited, less awake, less aware parts, and we are not fused with those forms of self, but we can contain them and host them and take a kind of charge of them. Obviously, the kinder we can be about that, self-compassion is a big part of this, because if we cannot, for example, self-forgive, it's very unlikely that we can extend authentic forgiveness to others. So this is a dance, always as within, so without. We need to be really, really hard on the structures that dehumanize, and we need to be very kind with all of the fleshy parts of systems. And so this is the intersection, right, of psychology and sociology and anthropology, and then the political movement, that we want to bring what we know about how humans work, how humans operate. We want to bring all of that to bear. For me, my primary mode is human development, and then psychodrama, both of which have, a lot to say about change. And so I believe very strongly that the pulse is liberatory and emergent, and that the conditions have to do with the ability to access spontaneity, the ability to be warmed up enough to meet the challenge, either through the adaptive process of a good enough response to a new situation, or an improved response to an old one, a new and improved response to an old one. This is, in a way, the motor of change. And that happens when conditions, I'm sorry that I keep saying the word conditions over and over, but that's what it is. When the conditions are right, we can access spontaneity. We can do a thing that we couldn't do before. And it's surprising and new, and it's the most divine aspect of our being, that we can create. Create ourselves.
You've got me wondering, forget about, how much we might be oppressing other people, as in terms of how much we must be oppressing ourselves, with the previous past of ourselves that, we might not be forgetting, and, we're probably still, putting the flashlight on it, and it might be deterring us in our course of our lives and in our evolution. So this is that balance.
And you've just defined trauma. Right? You've just brought, maybe the another really important component, which is trauma: personal, familial, generational and transgenerational, historical, ecological. So trauma is whenever there was too much, whenever something could not be borne, could not be held, could not be tolerated, and it broke us in some way. And so all of that lives in us. And so when we heal that, when we have the opportunity to heal trauma, we can show up much more generous to ourselves and to the world. And that's what the world needs. The world needs our generosity. The world needs our wholeness, not our perfection. When we heal, we don't become perfect. We don't stop making mistakes, but we become more and more able to learn from them. And we grow our capacity to witness ourselves and notice, oh, wow, it had you there, didn't it? There's that supremacy operating in you. There's that internalized aspect of oppression that tells you that you're not worth anything. Whether we're looking at it from the side of privilege and advantage or marginalization, we can come to self-observe. And then if we self-observe, we can observe with kindness others who are in the grip of it, and offer more and more well-tailored opportunities for everyone's liberation. And again, we don't have to wait until everybody becomes enlightened or, matures out of these bad, ancient habits of dehumanization. We can change systems. We can change systems quickly, and at the same time attend to these slower processes of consciousness, of evolutionary consciousness, and more relationship to, rather than embeddedness in previous organizations. They're not mutually exclusive. They work together. So we have to hurry up and bring change. And we also have to have patience for the parts that will take a long time.
And I like that, because if you're affecting systems, then you're sort of leveraging on a grander scale. And then, you can take care of the sort of the fine tuning alongside, changing systems. And it'll have a much larger impact where the systems will set the conditions for, the change that you want.
Exactly. Exactly.
I wanted to ask you, because, just finally, I read one of your papers, and you talk about, status, rank, and power. And I'm just going to quickly summarize this here, and please, correct me if I've not gotten it correctly. But you speak of these three elements, and it much reminded me of, in psychology, transactional analysis with Byrne, games people play.
Mm-hmm.
And, you speak of status. So status is equivalent to, a position you might have, like, might be the CEO of a company, or, the head, the driver of a bus, so in that bus, the driver's got the status, he's controlling the bus. And then you've got rank. And rank is sort of the meaning that someone might give to the status. And you split rank into, agent and target. An agent is someone with privilege, and target is someone, with impression. And then you've got power, and power you speak of is the internal power that we have, where, status does not exist and rank does not exist, I think personally. And you say it sort of happens maybe in that order of status, rank, and power. So someone might, be the CEO of a company, and someone might look to them, there's this unconscious sort of analysis happening, and see that rank, and someone might be passive in front of them. And if the CEO is, a bad CEO and is, maybe shouting at the subordinate, that's a form of oppression that's happening there, even though, both of them have equal power in terms of them inside of themselves. It almost seems like really, or idealistically, this should actually go backwards, right? You should start with your internal power, and then the meaning of the rank that you give to it doesn't really matter, because power is power, and that'll automatically give you the, status, right?
Well, I think of all three of these dimensions happening simultaneously, not in a sequence.
Okay.
I think that I construct it more like layers, like layers of the earth, or like the layers of a fruit, that we will tend to pick up the data at the status layer first, because it's on the surface. So we can tell the behavior that's happening. We can observe behavior and be responsive or reactive to that behavior. So I think of the status layer as the zone of the observable, the zone of the incidents or episodic experience of something happening that has a beginning and an ending, like that CEO is yelling at the subordinate, and it has the dramatic component of having a beginning, a middle, and an end. We can discreetly delineate the time that it started and the moment when it ended. I think of rank as the structures that are not episodic, but rather systemic, structural, and continuous. So these are more the forces and dimensions that are all around us and in constant effect. They don't start and stop. They don't occur and then cease to occur. They're non-episodic. So we use words like structural and systemic. We use metaphors like the water that the fish are in, that the fish don't know about. The unconscious elements of simply growing up in a particular social context and having so much that we absorb of those supremacist habits. So I think of rank as that systemic aspect, which if we look at an incident, if we look at that situation where someone is behaving in a way that we would consider hostile or inappropriate, then we can, if we bring the rank lens to that, we can see how socialization and conditioning and the assigning of either the advantaged role of agent or the marginalization, socialization and conditioning are playing into it. We can observe how that adds dimension, how it sets up that behavior, how there's differential cost and impact for the people in that scene, depending on their rank membership. And then underneath it all is, as I agree with you, underneath it all is this thing that I've termed power that just goes to the transpersonal. It speaks to things like oneness and a continuous web of interconnected consciousness that is probably the deepest truth. A bit like dreamless sleep might be the most truthful state, and dreaming a little bit more truthful, and waking the least truthful. So I think of these as layers more than I think of them as a sequence. We are always all of those things, and all of them are operating and having effect. The question becomes, where can we make an intervention when we want to make an intervention? If we make an intervention at the status level, the most performative observable layer. We're going to do things that maybe have an impact in the moment. They may or may not add up to a long-term change. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. It's absolutely important to interrupt bullying. It's crucial to name and disturb a pattern that's going to lead to harm. But a deeper kind of change comes when we bring social analysis to the question and investigate or inquire more as to how it got to be that way. How these, for example, two people find themselves in this conflict, how much of it is theirs and how much of it is a function of something broader. So as a couples therapist, for example, I might find myself, or with a family group, family therapy, I might find myself helping the family see that systemic structures are setting them up, right? Setting them up to have more conflictual relationship than they really want to be having. And so it's not uncommon for a couple to suddenly realize how much of their fight isn't really a fight, but something they've been set up to perform. And then at the core level, any practices, whether they be physical practices or consciousness practices or interpersonal practices that bring us back to center, that remind us of our place in the family of things, as the Wild Geese poem from Mary Oliver says. Anything that returns us to the sense that we are standing in a long line going back to the deepest ancestry and forward into the far future. Anything that connects us to the sense that we are webby, we are interconnected and interdependent and experiencing a sense of mutuality with one another. Anything that takes us back to that sense of self, that very, very vast sense of self, is nourishing and corrective, because it's medicine that can take, if you will, it can take the rank layer and the status layer and really relativize them. Not in a permanent way, but in a moment by moment way. So my gender socialization isn't going anywhere, and the dynamics of sexism are going to still operate both in internalized and horizontal, as well as systemic and structural ways. But I've never met you, and I'm, sharing a moment of connection with you that takes us to a pretty close place, a place of kind of breathing in unison and sharing a sense of what our deepest values are. And that can happen across, a line through a computer and through the sound waves of our voices and the, resonance in our hearts. So we are one. We are part of a much larger whole. And that wholeness is never absent, but it doesn't often get the microphone. And for that, I'm grateful to you.
No, well said. Listen, thanks so much once again for sharing your thoughts and coming on the episode. And I'm really glad you're tackling many subjects, but especially the subject of oppression with psychology and psychodrama, and the work that you're doing. Because of that, it gives us more of a grasp to be able to get into the topic, because there's no easy resolution. And just by scratching on the surface, it's not going to help at all. You're really approaching it as a fundamental layer as you seek. So once again, thanks again for coming on the episode, and I wish you well.
And you too. Thank you so much.